Good morning, everybody. Hopefully we are all bright-eyed and ready to go after a great concert last night. I know it's a little early, so I appreciate you guys showing up and listening to us drone on about the Composite API. But we really are excited about some of the features we're coming out with in pilot this release around the composite that we'll go over today. Do have to give you the forward-looking statement. If you guys have not seen this, congratulations. You've been living under a rock at Dreamforce, but I'm sure everybody else has seen it multiple times. What it is saying is that Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and if you are making any purchasing decisions, please make those decisions based on what is generally available in the product and not what is considered forward-looking or future technology. Everything we're going to be talking about today, with the exception of a couple things, is in pilot, so it is not generally available, so do not make purchasing decisions about what you see here today. My name is Jay Hurst. I'm a product manager here at Salesforce. Specifically, I run our enterprise API team. And with me is Abhinav Chadha. He is our lead engineer, one of the lead engineers on the enterprise API team responsible for building the Composite API. So, before we get started, we'll kind of shake it out a little bit, get a little audience participation. So we have been hearing from our customer base over the last few years that there are some challenges when you're trying to build applications against the Salesforce REST API. So raise your hand if you've ever used a Salesforce REST API. Great, okay, you're all on the right spot. How many of you have tried to build a client application using REST but have had issues with number of round trips, just the total delay it takes? All right. And finally, how many of you want to design with efficient APIs to reduce the number of round trips? Everybody, great. So we'll start with a little base setting on what is a composite API. So this is the idea of taking an API that is essentially an amalgam of multiple other APIs. So that single API request that you submit actually can make multiple calls in the back end and allow you to start to do some orchestration. So what I mean by orchestration is take some of the response from one of the calls and use it later down in the call chain as an input into another call. So for instance, I want to take an account, the ID created from that account I want to use when I create my associated contact. So compositions are really key when you're designing efficient APIs, whether that's for web applications or mobile applications, or even if you are building some sort of transactional application that you need some boundaries around the call. They really are key. Now, we have released a number of composite resources. I've been up on stage here for the last few years talking about them, watching them iterate through. So we'll recap those real quick. The first is the batching resource that we released about a year and a half ago. So this allows you to simply cut out the number of round trips. If you had, let's say, 5 unique REST API calls, you could bundle those together in a single payload, pass it to Salesforce. We would execute each of those serially, and then pass you back all the responses. Kind of not really complex logic there. It just really allows you to do one round trip rather than the 5 in that case. We also introduced the tree save, and this was really designed to start to give us some capabilities that matched our really old legacy import wizard, where you could do things like create an account and attach 3 contacts to it in the same file. So we wanted to replicate that in the API, where you can actually pass a nested structure of records. So you could do an account, multiple contacts under it, potentially multiple tasks or events under the contact, and then another account in that same chain. So you essentially pass us a tree. We then create all of those and attach all the IDs for you, so you don't have to bother with doing any of that. Also, we have Apex REST. So this is where you can essentially go hog wild, do whatever you want, build it up yourself, but it requires you to build everything yourself, which is not always the most friendly way. So looking at the batch, this is just a quick diagram. Here we see I have 9 operations here on the left. With batch, I simply pass all of those into a single request to the /composite/batch endpoint. Pretty straightforward. Tree save, similarly, if I want to pass all of these together, I would do so, and as we see, we can actually build the linking between the records as it's inserted. So you wouldn't have to create the contact after the account. We do that for you automatically. But as we've been going forward, it really becomes obvious that while batching is great and tree save suits a very specific need, we really want to kind of combine them into a more generic framework that you can use as just the Composite API. So the Composite API is a new API which will allow you to essentially take the concept of batch, the concepts of tree save, put them together, except you have more control, fine-grained control over what the linkings can do. So for instance, with the tree save, you can create the account and the contact underneath it, but you couldn't create a case and link it to multiple records in one call because that's a junction object. With the composite, you will be able to do that. We have a new notation, very similar to what you would find in Visualforce and Apex, where you can actually reference the chained calls up above. So if I pass in account 1, after that's created, I can then reference the fields that were created on that account. So I can use @account1.id, @account1.name, et cetera, et cetera. And this doesn't only apply to creation of records and update of records. It can be any of the REST API calls that we support. So if you do a describe, you could go ahead and reference the fields that were returned in the describe. We also introduced friendly URLs a couple releases ago, which is really a helper function to allow you to do kind of climb the resource hierarchy without having to know specific IDs, so run specific queries. So for instance, as we see here, if I went to SObjects account ID, and then contacts, that will give me all of the contacts against that account. Since contacts is the relationship, we can read that and return back a batch of records. Any of your custom relationships will work, so you can climb up and down that resource, and you can actually go 5 resources in. So I could go, if I went contact /ID /owner /ID, and I could keep climbing up that tree as I needed. Now this will give you the ability to really access multiple CRUD operations as well. Where tree save was only create, this will give you the ability to do updates, inserts, deletes, upserts, undeletes if you wanted, everything. So what does this look like? Very similar to what we saw in the tree save, except we'll notice at the bottom we also have a query and we have a describe against the case. We pass all of that in through, and I can actually begin to link things together. As we see, I have a case linked to one contact in a completely separate account. I have, that account also has a child case on its own. Tasks are related between multiple records. And I also get the query and the describe results. So through each of these steps, I can then refer to them using that notation. So if the bottom case was case 3, I could do @case3.id. That would give me the ID of the case. So what goes into a composite request? What is kind of the structure that we expect? There's 2 attributes. The first is all or none. And this gives you the ability to do a transactional boundary. So that means either the entire operation that you pass in is successful, or it's all rolled back. And this is very useful because you could not do this earlier through our standard API. If you, let's say, had to create 50 accounts and link 50 contacts into them, and that was all something that needed to be bound by a transaction, and the 49th failed, you would have to manually clean everything up yourself. But with this, we're able to roll back just like you would see in the Apex REST service, or the Apex classes. So if it's true, it's transactional. If it's false, we'll do, each one can be individual. The second attribute is the composite request itself, which has a number of attributes under it. So you essentially tell us the method that you want to use, post, patch, delete, get. You provide any of the headers that you want to support if you're doing any of our custom REST headers. You provide the URL of the resource you want to hit, such as the account /sobject/account or /sobject/contact/describe. A reference ID. Now this reference ID is a name that you give to that specific element in the chain so that you can reference it later. That's that account 1 that I referred to earlier. I could name it my account as well, or foo or bar or whatever I wanted. And then that is what you use to reference later. And finally the body, and this is the actual payload that you want to post to that endpoint that you give in the URL. So you're essentially taking your existing REST calls, like you would normally build them up. You kind of batch them all up together in a JSON request, put that into an array, and give us that array. So here's a quick example. Hopefully everybody can see this. But we see at the top the all or none is true. And then I have 3 methods in the composite request in this case. I'm doing a post to the account, so I want to create an account with the name of Salesforce. You'll see the reference ID is account 1. Then I want to update. We see the method is patch, so I want to update a contact, this specific contact, and I want to move it over to that account I created. So you see I'm referencing @1.accountID, @account1.id, sorry. And then finally, I'm doing a get against the account that I created and bringing back all of the contacts. So this will create an account, move a contact under that account, and then return a list of all of the contacts under that account I created. So that's the request. What does the response look like? The first is that there is the composite result. It's pretty straightforward. You get an array back for every request that you pass in. We'll give you a response. And there's 5 attributes here as well. We give you the headers that were returned, the status code, was it successful at 200 or 204 or 400, the reference ID, which is the reference that you can refer to that unique sub-request, and finally the body. And this is a little harder to see, apologies, but as we see here, what we see in the body of the composite results is I get the ID, success, there were no errors in this request. Here's the headers that were coming back. I see the body on the next call and the body on the third call. And this is actually the response that I received from that previous call in. So you'll see the successful call to the account 1, successful call to the contact 1, and the successful call to the query. So that was a lot to take in. Kind of wanted to get through the slides as quick as possible so that we could actually show you the demo and show you this in action. So with that, I'll bring up Abhinav, and he will demo this for us.
Thanks, Jay. Let me open up the demo. All right, so what I'm going to do in this demo, I have 3 demos. All of them are going to follow the same pattern. On the left, you see the traditional is how the world is without the Composite API, where you make, sorry.
That's part of the demo, too.
So on the left is where the traditional model, where you create an account, get the account ID back, then you use that account ID to create a contact, get that ID back, then use those 2 to create a case, and you do that. And on the right is the Composite API, where all of that is done in one shot. So if I just run the demo, we are just creating 4 records here. You see on the left is what traditional took. It took about 1.1 seconds to do it. And on the right, the same thing was done in 600 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds for 4 records. But this really gets more prominent when you're doing a lot of them. You see here, Composite API is completed in, it's created 60 records in 3.4 seconds, whereas the traditional one's going on, it's going on, it's going on, and it's taken more than 10 seconds to do the same thing that Composite API did in very less time. And if you see the records, what are created, it's the same thing. I have an account here, I have created a contact under it, I have created an opportunity under it, and I've created an activity. Again, from the composite side as well, same thing. The data is exactly the same, but the processing time is far less. So that's just a demo of what it takes to execute it. But moving on to the second demo, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create 3 accounts. I'm going to create 3 contacts under each account. I'm going to create 3 tasks under each contact related to the contact and account, and I'm going to run a describe. So that comes up to almost 79 operations. And getting the entire response and is like 2.6 seconds in composite, but traditional is still going on. It's still processing all that things. And if you see the result, this is the describe result that I got from the describe. I've created a contact account. And most of you guys should be familiar with that this is a save result. This does not tell me much about what account I created. It just gives me the ID back. But a lot of times when you're building UIs, you want to create the account and you want to get the response back to show the user what was created. So I did a get as well on that to get the ID back. So I create an account, get the save result. I load the entire object, doing the same with contact. So the number of operations that were executed here is 79. And 79 operations in Composite took 2.6 seconds, whereas the traditional also is the same result, but it took way longer to do that. So as we can see here, reducing the number of round trips can really benefit. And this demo is running in Heroku. And Heroku to Salesforce data centers, the lag is not that much. But if you take the same thing and you run this from a mobile phone, the latency that you incur there is a lot. So that's where you actually see the great benefit. But the third most important thing of this is transactionality. How many of you have ever tried to create, like Jay was mentioning, create the 49th account fails, and now you have to go back and do the cleanup, right? So here what I'm doing is I'm creating an account, I'm creating 3 contacts under it, and the last name on contact is a required field, so it's going to fail the validation because I'm not entering anything here, right? So in the traditional case, you create the account, you create the contact creation fails, but tough luck, the other accounts and contacts have already been created. You cannot go back. But with Composite, you just roll back the entire transaction, you can let the user know what the error was, and then you can move from there. So you see these 3 demos showcase the potential of Composite API.
Yeah, and I think it's key to highlight that again is that one of the biggest things that we're trying to do here is around performance. So when we're thinking of just doing 1 or 2 REST calls, you're not going to save a lot. You're doing very simple things. But as you start to push the REST API, and as we want to expand it to be more akin to our SOAP API, where you can create, say, 200 records at a time, as we push that boundary, squeezing out all of the performance that we can get is where it becomes very, very powerful. So in that example, rather than having to do 79 round trips, which you'd have to traditionally do, you can do 1 round trip and leave all of the processing on the Salesforce server side. And we can generally process pretty quick. It's the round trips, the building up of the context, the tearing down of the context, the serialization, deserialization. That's what takes a lot of the time in these processes. So reducing that reduces the overall time. As we saw, it was essentially, it's about 25% of the total time you use. So you're saving 75%, give or take.
Yeah, and I forgot to give this. So these 79 requests that I created, this is a sample JSON of it. So you see all on is true. I'm doing a describe on account. I'm creating an account. It's called account 0. And then I'm doing a get on it so that I get all the other details like created date, last modified date, all the thing, the entire account that's loaded. And again, I'm going to a contact. I'm creating a contact with account ID as account0.id. And then I'm doing a get on it. I'm creating a task under it where I'm doing who ID as the contact 0 and what ID as account 1. So you see, it just builds up the entire request, and you process all the 79 records at one. Okay.
Yep. And as far as the limits that we have around this right now, we're really focused on hitting that 200 mark. Like I said, we want to be able to achieve parity with SOAP. Again, give you more expanded functionality as well, but at least be able to do the same things with SOAP. So if you need to update 200 records, previously with the REST API, that meant making 200 REST calls, which is very inefficient. Now you can do that in 1. You do have to build up the request yourself on the client side, that's a little bit of time spent there, but it's still much quicker than building up individual unique requests. So fairly quick demo and explanation here, but what did we learn? We learned what the existing features are for the enterprise, that should say enterprise API tooling, or composite. But we learned saw batching a little bit, saw tree save. We got a little introduction into the Composite API, what it is, what does it look like, what does the response look like. We saw the demo, talking a little bit about the limits. And I don't have a slide for it, but I'll also talk about the roadmap. So right now in the winter release, this is in pilot. It is an open pilot. It's not automatically enabled, but if you go ahead and contact your account representative, they'll log a case with me. I'll go ahead and enable it on any of the orgs that you need, if that's production or sandbox or your developer edition org. It's pretty stable. It's been in production or in our test labs for about 8 months now. We've been running through it. It's been available as a pilot for the last release. So it's in a very good state, and we are targeting general availability for the spring release. There's a few things that we want to finish off around tooling, make sure that we can support tooling in this and queries, things like that. But with that, I will open it up for Q&A. If you guys have any questions, there's no mic. Okay, so you're going to have to shout really loud. We'll start here.
Yeah, how would you balance once this is new, how would you balance the decision to use this versus writing your own Apex
Sure.
endpoint in Salesforce, having
Sure. So the question is, how do you reconcile, when do I choose to write my own Apex REST versus using the composite? Really what I focus on there is if there's an existing REST API for that, meaning if you want to create an object or describe an object, something that you would normally do through our existing APIs, this is where you'd want to focus on using composite. If you're actually trying to put logic on the back end of like if-then branches or have some sort of conditional logic in what happens, that's really for Apex. So one of the things we're not trying to build here is another programming language through JSON. So this is really just to ease the use and make it so you don't have to go to Apex if you're just trying to do straightforward REST calls. Right back here. So the question is, can you call custom Apex REST endpoints in this? Currently, no.
Not
Not
yet.
right now. That is something that we're looking at. It becomes very difficult. Like I said, now you're using this to kind of build your own programming language. So I do want to keep a pretty hard line between the two. I want to make sure that it makes sense. So we do have a mic coming in the center if you guys want to line up as well. That way I can. That was your question as well? Okay, great.
I have a question on all or none. What happens if I have 100 accounts and maybe a corresponding 200 contacts, and if I choose all of none is false, and one of the 100 accounts got failed, is it the whole thing will success or one fail, or how it goes?
Yeah, so if you have, if you're using all or none is false, which means I do not want transactionality, and one of your 200 records fails, well, all the rest will still succeed. You'll get individual success responses, and the one, let's say it's number 99 in your chain, you'll get an error response for that.
But that account is created, and maybe one out of those contacts is created also, right?
Correct. Now, if all or none was true, and that last one failed, the whole thing rolls back and it doesn't. So
there's no mix possible.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do and how you want to run that transactionality. Now, in the case of SOAP, if I was creating 200 accounts, we wouldn't roll back that entire set. We would just tell you, hey, this one failed, fix it. Right? So
Yeah,
it depends on what your use case is.
I like that. How do you do the upset on these bulk things? How do you pass the external keys to that, do the upset?
So through REST, upsert is done by going to the /account or the /object name / the name of the external ID field, and then you pass and then / the value of that external ID field. So if your external ID was foo and the value is 1234, I'd go /account /foo /1234, and I pass in whatever data I want to change as the body. So that's all documented as well. Upsert is supported through REST.
What are the effects on limit usage?
So right now, this is one API call for the entire composite. So it definitely will give you a more efficient use of the API. We're playing around with how that might work when we build in query as well, so that you could actually do maybe some simple iteration through query results. So maybe we enforce limits on the query if you're doing something like that. But for now, it's all one single call, just like it would be in SOAP.
Just wanted to know about the callouts. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering, when you send multiple requests to the Composite API, if there are no dependencies between those callouts, will it actually run them in parallel, or is it always going to run them in sequence?
So I'll let Abhinav talk.
Yeah, it's always going to run in sequence. We don't do parallelism yet.
Okay.
So it's going to be run in sequence, but you'll still save on the round trips of servers that you have. So the latency that you incur when you take a round trip to Salesforce servers, you'll save on that.
Okay. Are there any plans at this time to support parallel calls?
Not right now. No, I don't think.
We've talked about it. I think the first step here is getting the composite out, trying to figure out how much performance gain we get there, which is, like I said, it's looking very good as far as the overall performance. Mm-hmm. After that, we can start looking. The reason for parallelism would be another performance gain, really, and so it's kind of the diminishing returns. If we're only getting a 2% bump by using parallel, it's not worth it, but if we start finding that it is very viable, we'll definitely look into adding that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hey, Jay here, couple of questions. In the traditional approach, when we make multiple API calls, we do one by one, so there are separate transactions. It doesn't add to long-running query. But when we do the Composite API call, does it add on to the long-running query because we are trying to group everything in a single transaction?
Sure. So since each of these are run as their own transactions or their own processes, it's not one entire long-running query. Each one of those would have its own concurrency requests, if that's the question you're asking. So for everybody else, if you're not aware, you have a limit to the number of long-running transactions you can make in Salesforce. You can make up to 25 requests that are taking longer than 20 seconds, and then we kind of have to stiff arm you a little bit. But since each of these are going to be run separately, it's not one long transaction that will likely run over 20 seconds. It's going to be the sub requests are each run individually. Now, if you pushed in 10 queries and those 10 queries were running and you did 10 different composite calls, that could definitely be multiple long-running requests. But since these are run in serial, we run the first one, and then when that's done, we run the second one, so you're not aggregating the time for the long running.
Thanks. And is Composite API restricted to doing a DML operations of the data, or can I declare my Apex resource and then group multiple Apex resource in Composite API?
Sure.
And then
So
make a call?
yeah, and that was similar to the question asked before. So you cannot right now call the Apex REST services. It's only the standard REST services under
/services/data.
/services/data. Anything under there is what we can use. Anything under /apex, we just cannot do yet. Any other questions? Okay, so, we have one more.
Two more actually.
Two more, okay.
So first question is custom objects. Is that supported or not?
Absolutely. So everything you can do through the standard REST API, you can combine in the composite.
Perfect. Second thing is, what about the SOQL limits or any governor limits? Are these, you said those are different transactions, right?
Yes.
So how the governor limits are met?
So if you're talking about Apex triggers, for instance, they're run just like you would run a standard REST call. So let's say I have on my account 4 triggers that take, they use 200 sockle or 100 sockle, and it takes 10 seconds to run that. When I pass that in composite, that first account create has its own set of governor limits. Then when the next one comes in, it's going to have its own set of governor limits. Third one will have its own set. So it's just like making these individual calls. You're not going to get expanded limits, but we're not reducing the limits either.
Oh, perfect. So it's just saving the round trips for us, right?
Yeah,
Perfect.
saving the round trips and also saving the logic around
Yes.
doing the ID mapping on your own, right? So
Yes.
normally you'd get the account, you'd have to take the account ID you received, put that into your contact call, then create the contact. So we're saving that logic, we're just pushing it to the Salesforce side.
Yes. And third question is about the all or none option. So you said that all or none fails the entire transaction.
Yes.
Can it be at the object level by any chance? Like if I want my contacts to be inserted, but not my
So not right now. The only way, the easiest way to make this happen would be to just take the entire composite call and say all of this succeeds or fails. If you wanted to do, say, all of my accounts succeed or fail and all of my contacts, you would want to split those into 2 separate composite calls. Then you could get transactions on both of them. Having the ability to do transactional boundaries within that, so I could maybe have 5 transactions in the same composite request. We've talked about it, but we haven't really gotten a whole lot of progress there, just on the complexity.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah.
So right now it happens that all the transactions are governed under individual limits, but considered a single transaction.
Yeah.
That's why all or none fails everything else.
Correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I'll give everybody 10 minutes back of your time. Feel free to grab some coffee, get ready for the next session. Enjoy the rest of your Dreamforce, and thank you for coming.